a couple of recent stories about utilities. One that I thought would have gotten more attention than it did, and the other that I definitely think should have gotten more attention, and I hope will very quickly. But here to talk about that with us now is our go-to person for all things utility. Gavin Bade is a senior reporter at Utility Dive, and he joins us now. So Gavin, thanks for coming back on the program.
Well, thanks for having me, RJ. I'm glad to be back.
So we're glad to have you. And let's start with this story. There was a story with all the discussion of Russia and espionage and all that. I would have thought this story would get major play, and it didn't. And perhaps that's all for the best. But you'll clarify it for us, namely that the Department of Homeland Security has warned utility operators that Russia has been hacking them, and perhaps was even able to, in the parlance, throw some switches. Is that right? First of all, am I getting the DHS comments essentially right?
Yes, absolutely, RJ. So what happened this week was the Department of Homeland Security is running a few web briefings to kind of detail the threats that they've observed to the power sector in terms of cybersecurity, hacking, not just from Russia, but from other from independent agents as well. These results had been known to the power sector for about a year, so it wasn't really new news that there was hacking going on, that utilities are under constant threat and constant attack from these, state-sponsored actors and others. People have known that. What was different this week was how DHS expressed the threat, the way that they framed it. They said that some of these attackers, there had been hundreds, quote, hundreds of victims of these attackers over the past few years, and some of the attackers had gotten to the point where they could, quote, throw switches on the power grid, meaning that they could, get into the industrial control system of a plant or a substation or a pipeline or something and overload the system, throw switches to disrupt service to the power sector or something like that. Naturally, this sent off alarm bells, not just in the power sector, but also in cybersecurity, in the cybersecurity community as well, for people just trying to evaluate, okay, just how vulnerable is our grid to these actors, whether they're sponsored by Russia or other people.
So obviously they were taking a broad definition of who the actors might be, but you did some reporting on this, and was the story, was the extent of the threat exaggerated, you think, by the DHS, or was it misinterpreted by, I mean, apparently there's a real threat, first of all, right?
Certainly there is a real threat, and I'm not, it might be too much to say that DHS misinterpreted or exaggerated the threat. I think some of the reaction to it afterwards and the way that some of it was reported maybe made it into something that DHS didn't want to convey in their briefing. So, some of the cybersecurity experts that I would talk to would say, okay, even if an actor is able to flip these switches, to really make a widespread disruption on the power grid would take an automated effort to do this across dozens or hundreds of places on the power grid, whether it's a pipeline or a power plant or something else. And they say that our adversaries, whether it's Russia or someone else, they're just not that sophisticated yet. Not only that, but a lot of these efforts were really reconnaissance and just surveillance efforts on the power grid, kind of trying to figure out how different assets work and how they operate. Now that can be very worrying. Because why do you do surveillance on a sector or on a system if you don't want to gain the ability to affect its operation? But I think the experts that I've talked to say that we're not at the stage that any actor could cause a widespread disruption in the power sector. It's just that they may be trying to learn how to do so. Right.
So they're probing is one way to put it. They're probing. They're pushing. And do we know? Was there any clarity on who these probers or characters, shadowy figures were? Did DHS say that they were primarily or partly Russian, or were they of unknown origin?
DHS was actually pretty clear in this briefing that they said that these were actors that were aligned with the Russian government. Now, whether they are, directly employed by the Russian government or are from a supportive group or something like that, is not particularly clear. I think there's, those lines are very blurry in some sense. But they were pretty clear that these were agents that were, the threat that they were talking about were agents aligned with the Russian government.
So, okay, and so they're probing us, they're testing us, they're trying to get at us. What happens next? I assume that what happens now is that the industry ups its efforts to protect itself. I would certainly hope that would be the response, that the industry ups its efforts to prevent itself from being hackable, because I would think even if it's distributed, even if they can only affect, I think you said, perhaps as many as few as a few hundred people at a time in some cases, that's too many. So I would assume that what they're trying to do now is figure out how to improve their ability to keep these people out, right?
Absolutely. And the utility sector will tell you that they've been working hard on this with the government and their regulators since these threats were first revealed to them more than a year ago. And I think that, there's a number of agencies that are putting together new standards for cyber reporting. But one thing that was extremely interesting to me in this most recent briefing was how the hackers got into these utility systems. They didn't go and directly hack the utilities. They went to their suppliers, a software company or something like that, that supplies a tool that a utility will use. They would get credentials from those, supposedly people who were their suppliers, and they would use that to get into the utility. So one thing that the utility sector is really focused on now is beefing up the cybersecurity of their supply chain and making sure that they're that all of their suppliers are subject to the same standards that they are in terms of reporting cyber threats and things like that. And then I think that another important line of defense for the sector is just to make sure that even if an attacker does get in, and even if they can disrupt something for a moment, that the system is resilient enough that they can redirect power flows, that they have enough infrastructure in place that even if they disrupt one thing, you can still run a different power plant, you can redirect the power through different lines, and you can resist the threat that way. So when I talk to people in the sector, it's prevention, but then it's also resilience and being able to bounce back from any outage just as fast as possible.
I'm old enough to remember when I was a child, the great Northeastern blackout of 1967, and when in New York City, but enormous parts of the Northeast all went out, and one of the prevailing theories, as we speculated in the dark, was that the Russians were doing it. But it sounds like the system is more decentralized, resilient now. They wouldn't be able to, they didn't do it then, but they wouldn't be able to do it too easily now. But it also sounds like protection is warranted. And by the way, the other theory that was being kicked around in the dark was aliens. So the other story I wanted to talk to you about, Gavin, again, we're talking with Gavin Bade of Utility Dive, was, and I think this really needs to be discussed more, the story that came out that the Trump administration wants to rescind the state of California's right to regulate vehicle emissions in its own state. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. This was one of the first actions of the new EPA administrator, Andrew Wheeler, who of course stepped in when Scott Pruitt resigned because of all of his scandals. So what the EPA is going to seek to do here, and we're still waiting for the official rulemaking, but according to reporting, what EPA is going to seek to do here is rescind the waiver that California has under the Clean Air Act to set their own vehicle emission standards. Back when the law was crafted in 1970, California was dealing with very serious smog issues, even more serious than they deal with today. And they said to the federal government, we don't want to be saddled with a less stringent standard under the Clean Air Act if you end up setting up a national standard for auto emissions. And they were able to win, written into the bill, the original bill, a waiver from the Clean Air Act standards saying that they could set, and other states could set, standards for vehicle emissions that were higher than the national standard. As long as they were not lower, it's okay. So since then, California has always set more aggressive standards for auto emissions than the rest of the nation. And the big three in Detroit, other automakers, they really don't like this because California is such a large market that if you want to sell cars throughout the entire United States, you kind of have to make them to meet the California standards. So this has been a long-standing kind of bugaboo among the auto industry and also the oil industry. And now it seems that the Trump administration is going to try to rescind that waiver that's been in place for so long.
Well, and I assume I hadn't thought about the oil industry's involvement. I was only thinking about the automakers, but so I assume the oil industry's interest is that the more fuel-efficient cars become, the less oil or fuel they burn, and while that may be great for the environment, that means the less fuel that they're selling, I guess, right?
You're absolutely right. I saw some interesting modeling this week from the think tank Energy Innovation, and they modeled that by 2035, if the if the Clean Air Act waiver for California is suspended, there will be 20% higher gasoline usage nationwide if the Trump administration does what they want to do, which is actually not just rescinding the waiver for California, but also freezing auto emission standards at 35 miles per gallon as a fleet average. This was going to be the standard in 2020 under auto regulations that the Obama administration put into place. And then they were supposed to accelerate up to 2050. But under Trump's plan, under the reported plan, these standards would freeze at 35 miles a gallon in 2020. Excuse me. And as I said, the modeling that I saw this week said that it would result in 20% higher gasoline consumption in the United States by 2035. So obviously that is a big boon to the oil industry.
Yeah, I would think. Now, one of the things that struck me about this, well, a number of things struck me about this. One of them was that, and I know politics is not necessarily your beat, but it struck me that conservatives are always going on about states' rights. This seems to me to be a major override of a state's rights on this issue anyway, but I suppose it's a right that's been, as you've just explained, uniquely conveyed to California. You mentioned that this could inspire a lengthy court battle, and that interests me because if the waiver was built into the law, wouldn't the law need to be amended rather than just the EPA making a decision? Wouldn't Congress actually have to pass a new law changing things?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's going to have to be decided by the courts in this case. I think already there have been, just when EPA announced that they were going to review the vehicle emission standards set by the Obama administration, there were a number of groups that went ahead and sued them already in the D.C. Circuit Court, saying you can't do that. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting about that, you had your usual environmental groups that would sue the Trump administration and have become very practiced at doing that. But you also had three, of the largest, some of the largest utilities in the country ganging up and suing the Trump administration as well, because they have a stake in making sure that there are more electric vehicles on the roads than gasoline vehicles. And the interesting thing about rescinding California's waiver is it would also rescind their authority to set electric vehicle targets. And they are by far the biggest electric vehicle market in the nation, with a target of 1.5 million vehicles on the road by 2020. So one thing that I think you could see here is, renewed, I don't know if you want to call it activism, but lobbying from the electric utility sector to try to keep these standards in place, because now they're seeing that, oh, we have a stake in not the gasoline vehicle, but the electric vehicle, because of course we sell the power that powers these vehicles.
So you actually have, in addition to the interests of arguably the planet and the future of humanity, I would say
yes,
you also have competing financial corporate interests. You have, I don't mean to caricature by just reducing it to personalities, but on the one hand, you can say you have the Koch brothers lobby and the current auto lobby. On the other, you have Elon Musk and the electric car maker lobby and whoever else has invested. I don't know where somebody like Ford or Chevy would come out in this, given that they both make high fuel consumption vehicles and electric vehicles as well, the Volt and so on. I'm not sure where they would fall out on all of this, but it's fascinating. Any sense of what the next steps are? Are they going to is it pretty clear that the administration is going to put this forward and then the challenges will begin in court?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that eventually the administration will put forth a proposed rule from the EPA that will freeze the standards at 2020 levels and rescind California's waiver under the Clean Air Act. After that, they will have to take comments and go through the normal rulemaking process, during which time I expect that it will be challenged even more in court, and we'll have to just see, which judges at the D.C. Circuit get selected to hear the case, as we have, as is the question in a lot of these regulatory rollbacks. So I think we can, all expect a lot of court cases in the years to come about this and other future rollbacks that the EPA is slated to roll out.
Last question. While they're all fighting it out in court, do we know, would the EPA's ruling go into effect in the meantime, or would it be stayed in the meantime until there was a decision?
That would be up to the courts themselves. In the recent past, the Supreme Court actually took the very unprecedented step of freezing Obama's climate change regulations for power plants because they said it was so controversial that they froze it from going into effect. That power plant regulation is now under review. The EPA is expected to roll it back as well. They have not released that final rule, but it remains to be seen whether a court panel at the D.C. Circuit Court would say, "Oh, this is so controversial, we need to freeze it." But yeah, that would be up to the judges.
Well, it's a fascinating story and a really important one. So both of them are. So thanks for reporting on them, Gavin Bade, senior reporter at Utility Dive, and thanks for coming on the program again and talking about them.
Thanks, RJ. Thanks for having me.